Hi, and hopefully welcome back to part 2 of the Building the Glottkin. In this video we will take the model from its base primer coat all the way through to inks and highlights. I shall also cover any other paints that I use, and I'll hopefully give call outs so you know which colours I've used. The first stage is zenithal highlights. Here I'm using Dawler & Rowney white ink. So as to not make the contrast too high, I'm giving most upper surfaces a light coat of the ink. This means that when I'm going over with opaque colours, you don't end up with too extreme a transition between the dark areas and the light areas. One thing to be aware of with this ink is that it is actually fairly opaque itself, so when you put a layer on it may look quite bright when it's wet, but as it dries it will actually become more transparent and you will see the base black coat through it. This is why, as you see the model here, some of the areas look quite bright and others look quite generally grey. The generally grey areas are those where the ink has already dried. And then you can see that I go over this again in multiple layers, exaggerating the highlights on upper surfaces, lumps and bumps, and you can see at the end the result as it is in the picture. Now it's time to start blocking out the base colours. Here I'm using Castellane green, although for the airbrush I've mixed it down with matte medium and also a little bit of flow improver. You can see that where I'm blocking out the colours here that the paint is actually showing the ink and dark undercoat quite well underneath. In this you'll be able to see that I'm just blocking out all the areas that are going to be green. It doesn't matter if you go over areas a little bit, because one of the nice things about airbrushing is that if you have a little bit of overspray, when you put in your next colour they'll blend the two colours together quite nicely. Now onto one of my favourite colours, venerable snakebite leather. This is the original 1990s version, not the newer contrast paint version. Again, you can see I'm blocking out most of the areas of colour, areas of the belly, slight undersides, the arm. And next, one of the first contrast paints I was using is Blood Angel Red on the end of the tentacles and things like that. I actually quite like this colour. A lot of people seem to prefer the Flesh Tearers red, however. You can also see here I'm using Ashanti Bone to highlight all the areas of like nails and horns and such. There's a bit of a jump coming up next. I highlighted the Castellane green with Lorient green. Unfortunately I hadn't realised that my camera's memory card run out. After that I'm now doing the patches of fur and such in Scrag Brown. Next, one of my favourite Barts, using Athlonian Camo Shade. I then covered almost all the green parts with this in order to unify all the highlights I'd added, and also to darken the recesses and such as well. I must admit, the effect on the skin tones when it was all wet looked really quite impressive. Next up, one of my favourite stages, highlighting with dry brushing. Here I'm using Nurgling green to just accentuate the lighter areas which are exposed to direct light from above, such as heels, folds of skin and such. One thing to be aware of when dry brushing a large surface like this, try and brush in a downwards stroke so that you don't get any the areas that you're highlighting underneath the folds of skin. You want to get it purely on the top. Next it's time to start working on all the areas of bone and hoof and such. So I'm using progressive layers of Agrax Earthshade to darken down the bases of the horns. On a lot of these models you see that the tips of the horns are darker than the base, whereas to my mind it would be kind of the other way around, as the ends of the horns and such get weathered and bleached by the sun. Next, using a detail brush, it's time to start picking out all the boils and areas that you're going to be using yellows and other colours, secondary colours on really. So I go around picking out all the boils and eyes and skulls and such. Next I use the Eandon yellow contrast paint to go over the eyes and such, and boils, sorry, to give them their colour. It actually also works as a counter shade as well as the main colour, so I actually kind of like it for this purpose. Next up is Vallejo's Pale Sand. I use this for highlighting all the areas of the tips of like nails and tips of the teeth on the hand, and also I use it for dry brushing on the horns themselves. I quite like this colour for this. It's quite a nice neutral colour for using for highlights on things like this, and also yellow and such as well. It's at this point I use Wild Rider Red to highlight all the tentacles and areas of red on the model. Finally, for the exposed bowels and other bits and pieces on the model which require it, like the tongue and such, I use some Blood for the Blood God. And here is the completed model. The base isn't finished yet. I'm going to be doing that as my final video in this series. I've also picked out the eyes and such, which I haven't shown here in great detail, but hopefully when I do the end video with the base and everything else as well, I'll show some of the finer details in still shots.